What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, an affiliate of Mad in America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at madinamerica.com. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today, my guest is Caroline Mazel-Carlton. Caroline is a survivor of psychiatric crisis diagnosed with psychosis. She's the director of training of the Wildflower Alliance, formerly known as the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, and part of the Jewish Renewal Movement and studying to be a rabbi. So welcome to Madness Radio, Caroline Mazel-Carlton.
Thanks, Will.
You do a lot of work with the Hearing Voices movement. You do a lot of training around the U.S. and internationally, and you're very much involved in new approaches to mental health and working with people and systems transformations. So it's great to have you on the show and to hear something about your own personal experience with mental health recovery.
Thank you so much for having me, Will. It's really great to be here. So, like a lot of people that get involved in this work and in this movement, what drew me to it are my own personal experiences of pain.
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to start. Do you want to just talk about that and how that maybe led you into the mental health system, and then how it is that you kind of got out of the system and now you've built this life for yourself and this career for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I certainly am not originally from Western Mass, where I currently live. I grew up in a place called Indiana. Indiana is not a place where you really want to let your freak flag fly. You don't question authority. Mm-hmm. What was difficult about that for me as a young person was there were folks in authority roles that hurt me. So a lot of what I went through was kind of framed as punishments. For example, I remember one time as a kid, I drew a flower on my hand and I thought it was this really beautiful thing. And I showed it to a teacher and she kind of like flipped out on me for having drawn on myself and started screaming at me like really loudly in front of these kids. And she dragged me into a room and poured like floor cleaner on my hand and started like put scalding water and like started scrubbing it with a brush while she was yelling at me. But, you know, being a young person, I think what was confusing about it was, you know, it was framed as a punishment. So I didn't understand that what was happening to me and the things that I was seeing happen to other children weren't okay. So it made the world feel like this very scary place.
So that happened a lot. That was just one example of the kind of thing that you had.
Yeah, definitely. And so, you know, for me, when I first started having, you know, perceiving things like visions or voices that other people didn't perceive, it wasn't really a scary thing for me. In some ways, they were very comforting because some of the voices that I heard were like adults and they weren't quite as mean.
So you say voices and visions. What kinds of things were you experiencing? It sounds like they were maybe more positive and they weren't threatening at all, but they were definitely perceptually different than the people around you.
Yeah, I remember, for example, hearing this man's voice. I remember hearing him. I was like sitting next to my Big Bird Big Wheel out in the yard, and I was like watching the woman who had hurt me in the past, the one that I mentioned, and she turned to this other woman, like her friend, like next to her, and she was like, "You know, Maureen, there ain't a cloud in the sky." And I remember really clearly hearing this voice that said just over my shoulder, "They're liars. They're liars. There are clouds in the sky, and I hate them."
So the voices that you heard weren't just kind of like arbitrary. They were very much a response to this illegitimate authority and this punishment world that you were in. They were kind of like allies and standing up for you and supporting you and validating you.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely felt that way. And I mean, things got a little bit harder so I'm 36. So when I was 8 years old, it was the time of the first American Gulf War. And it was at that time when things kind of really fell apart for me.
Hmm.
And I started having these visions of like green lights. I couldn't sleep at night. I was scared all the time. I would hear like screaming and crying.
Do you think that was related to the war that was going on in the media and people getting really apprehensive about that? And
I think so. And I remember like being that age and like coming to the attention of like a teacher, and she was saying to me, "Oh, we're going to get you some help." And I was like, "Oh, good. Like she's going to help me like figure out how to stop this war." That she's going to take me and we're going to finally figure out how to make the bombs stop falling, and that will make things better.
because that was the help that you felt was needed in the situation.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought that was what was going to happen.
But then what happened that wasn't what she did.
No. So what happened was I went to see a doctor. And so, yeah, I was 8 years old. That was the first time. But even though I wasn't like this very like worldly kid by any means, you know, I understood like you go to the doctor because there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong inside you. Less so because, you know, there's a war, or kids are getting hurt, or you're afraid kids are going to get hurt.
And so you went to this doctor, and what did the doctor say? How did the doctor respond when you were eight years old?
What I remember well is that it wasn't long before I had what I call my pill plate, where, you know, I was a kid and, you know, I would go out to the breakfast table and there would be like, you know, my cereal bowl. And then next to it, there would be this plate of pills. So, you know, I got this message, but it sort of continued for the next couple decades of my life that there was something internally wrong with me, but that it had a solution. And that solution, it always came in pill form. So I took medication from a young age and for many, many years.
What were you taking?
Risperdal, Seroquels. Some were called like antipsychotics. Some were called anti-anxiety. They had all these like anti-names, like that they would take, you know, my problems away. Like they would be like the antidote.
So looking back now that you've sort of lived your life and have this different perspective, what do you think was going on? What do you think it all meant? You mentioned the war. You mentioned not having a place for your emotions. You mentioned this kind of punishment that was happening from authority figures.
Yeah. I don't know. I think for me, a lot of it was this call to heal the world. Like I remember, you know, I was having these visions at one time and it felt like they really did mean something. They were very specific. Like I was seeing specific people, and at school they were there, but some of them, it would look like they were like bleeding from their head. And I would see this and it was disturbing, but it also felt like, I don't know, like maybe I was supposed to help these people, or there was some sort of problem, like that it meant something. It felt like they needed something from me. But, you know, when I went to the therapist and tried to like figure out, you know, what does this mean? What can I do? You know, basically she told me what it means is you have a neurodegenerative disease. And if you don't take these medications, that your brain will further degrade.
So these visions are pointing in the direction of healing people. And that kind of, it sounds like, became your calling. Your life calling is very much someone who's because you're now a teacher and a trainer and a healer and a counselor and a helper in your life now.
Yeah, I work to do that. I work to heal the world, certainly. I think one of the things that I didn't get that I try to hold for people now is that it's normal to feel fear and pain in the face of war. It's normal to have these seasons in our life of despair. It's normal to wander and feel confused. But, it's also something that we don't have to go through alone. And that wasn't quite what I got, because there weren't a lot of people around me that were open about their own struggles or how they made meaning of that. And it certainly, my experiences were not normalized. I think what I really needed more of was community.
And so how did you first get into the hospital system, and what was that, many years that you were in and out of hospitals? And
Yeah. So for me, like my longest hospitalization occurred after I had been charged with a felony, like felony theft. I was trying to get money to buy drugs. And so for me, like getting that message really early that, the solution to our problems comes in pill form, I took that and ran with it. I definitely had periods of my life where, I used like opiates and non-prescribed drugs, or abused the drugs that were prescribed to me. But it was a lot of it just because, this was what was presented to me in my culture, like as a solution. And I think that's really common. And so it was one of those moments where, you can either go to jail and be charged for this crime, or you can go to the hospital long term, because what was argued by my attorney was that I had a mental illness.
so it seemed like the better of the two options at the time.
Right. Yeah.
And then what happened in the hospital?
There was a part of me that thought, okay, like this is going to be like this serious hospital. It was a long-term hospital in Houston, Texas. It was well regarded. And I kind of thought, okay, there'll be something here that gives me some answers. But when I got there, it was kind of the same. They took my belt, they took my shoelaces, they took like almost everything I had. And so it was sort of this, we don't trust you vibe. You're dangerous and you're fragile at the same time. And, it was not a place where I found a lot of answers, though there were, those moments. If people have been hospitalized, like, I'm old. So like I was hospitalized in like the early 2000s. So I remember like the smoking rooms. And of course there can be a lot of like deep wisdom and sharing like in those smoking breaks.
Yeah, the smoking scene, the smoking balcony, or the smoking room was definitely where a lot of the action in the community building was going on. I would often go into those rooms even though I didn't smoke.
Yeah, and there was something that I never forgot about those spaces. I mean, I had never heard of like peer support or mutuality, and it wasn't like something they talked about there. But that sense of community, and as I said before, there weren't a lot of people telling me that, hey, there's pain in life. You will struggle. Things like war and rape are terrible, and they cause you pain because that pain is drawing you to pull people closer and then hopefully address it together. But I did get the beginnings of that message like in those smoking rooms.
From the other patients.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more about some of the hospital experiences that you had?
Well, there is one memory I have. I remember like I was in that hospital for so long that I was there like throughout Hanukkah. We weren't allowed to have matches or anything, but they had this menorah like outside the nurses' station because they had to like represent all faiths.
The menorah is the candles for Hanukkah.
Yes, exactly. So there wasn't anyone on staff that was Jewish. This was in Houston, Texas, but there were a number of, like I said, like those of us who were patients there were. But of course, like I didn't believe in anything, I believed that life was just sort of pain.
Hmm.
But I remember someone asking me, do you want to light this menorah? And it was weird because, we were right outside the med room and we couldn't light it. So it was an electric menorah where we had to like screw in the bulbs. And so when you light a menorah, like on the first night of Hanukkah, there's like this baracha, there's this sacred statement that you make called the Shehecheyanu. And basically it's saying like, it's giving gratitude for like the universe for all that had to happen for you to survive to see this one moment. And it was weird to say it because there were people like some of us that had literally tried to kill ourselves like in the past year. Like one of the patients was like in a back brace because she'd tried to throw herself off of a bridge. But here we were, like we were huddled around this thing and we were saying these ancient words. And I think it was in that moment, and I was definitely in a psych ward, and it was definitely one of the worst chapters of my life where I felt something that might pull me out of it in the presence of something bigger and holy. And yeah, that's a moment that I've never forgotten, that I've taken with me. And I feel like a door kind of opened in me as we did that, as we kind of like honored survival, even though a lot of us had come close to not surviving.
Wow, that's beautiful. So it sounds like that was the beginning of maybe your connection or reconnection to Judaism. Did being Jewish become a resource for your own survival and your own recovery or transformation? How did that happen?
Yeah, it certainly did in some interesting ways. So I spent a lot of time, in treatment facilities, but eventually I was able to graduate to living in a halfway house, like living in a house where like you're allowed to leave, but you have to come back at a certain time. And there's like staff people that live there with you. And so for a lot of folks in group homes, like you're supposed to leave during the day and like do something. And I couldn't find a job because I didn't have any kind of work experience. So I started doing, like I had remembered like some of those moments. And so I started working at the JCC, like in a volunteer role. And
The JC, the Jewish Community Center.
yes, exactly. Because for me, it was like, at that point, like I had nothing in my life. Like I had no degree, I had no relationship or children. Like all I had for an identity was like my criminal record and my psych record. What, Judaism and culture gave me was this whole other identity beyond mental patient that I could tap into.
And when did you start studying Judaism? Because now you're in training to become a rabbi and you really brought this into your life in a very deep way. It sounds like it led you to a much deeper understanding of yourself and also madness and the meaning of what it is to see visions and voices. So when did you start studying Judaism? What have you learned from that study?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'll offer is, so Martin Luther King, I think one of the things that kind of gets left out about Martin Luther King sometimes is that he was a religious man. He was definitely a man of faith. A lot of what he did was grounded in sacred and prophetic texts, which are like shared in Judaism, like Amos and Micah. And, Malcolm X was also a very religious man, a man of deep faith who made like pilgrimage to Mecca. And so what I think is incredible about, some of these sort of religions, that religion has kind of become a dirty word and like we don't want to talk about it and we're like, oh, we don't need that. But I see that there can be this like profound like anti-capitalist, almost rootedness in some of these faiths, these powerful values that are about like sharing wealth, like taking care of the planet, taking care of each other, honoring like the sanctity of human life. So in terms of like where I see Judaism, like for me, and I think for most people, like my struggles that brought me into the mental health system had to do with the culture around me, had to do with human life not being treated with sanctity. And so I feel like there's incredible potential, which is one of the reasons why, you know, I want to be a rabbi and have this conversation a lot. I think there's incredible potential to shift how we treat people. And so much madness, I think, is about feeling like a stranger or being treated like a stranger. And in the Torah, it says 36 times that we're not supposed to oppress the stranger. There's actually one part of Torah where it says, don't oppress the stranger, for you know the soul of the stranger, because you too are strangers. And so I think, you know, a lot of our system is not set up well in honoring like the stranger and honoring that we also have had, you know, most of us have experienced pain and loss, and who gets labeled as ill or not has a lot to do with these cultural factors. So I'm just really excited about the potential of reclaiming some of these traditions and value systems that have been lost and like their healing potential.
Do you think that healing potential is really in the tradition, or is it more just the tradition is kind of can be read and interpreted in so many different ways? Do you think there's something really in Judaism itself, or is there something that you bring to it?
You know, there's this great quote by Bob Dylan, another Jewish person, that I really love. It's a song on Slow Train Coming. And he talks about, he's like, you're going to have to serve somebody. You're going to serve somebody. And he's like, now it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. And what I identify with that is, I think sometimes like in liberal culture, we're like, oh, you know, morals are relative, and, you know, what's right and wrong really shifts, and we kind of reject like some of these value systems. But I think what happens sometimes is that these other like value systems come into that empty space and claim it. So what I mean is, like, for me, when I was a kid and I was struggling in that empty space where there weren't a lot of value systems, I think the medical model sort of swooped in and like put its flag in the ground and claimed it. But yeah, I feel like for me, you know, so much of what healing meant was sort of finding an identity, finding a purpose, finding strength and meaning. And ultimately, the mental health system doesn't do a great job with things like identity, meaning, and purpose. I mean, they could provide me with an identity, like the identity was, you know, bipolar, borderline. One woman thought I had Asperger's syndrome. I don't even know if that exists anymore. So there were these various identities, but they didn't really provide me with much in terms of strength and purpose.
And the space of not being religious, you could say, well, I don't really worship anything. I'm just living my life. Well, maybe you're also worshiping money or worshiping success or worshiping consumerism. We all have this kind of default value system, and maybe religion just organizes it in a more explicit way. And the secular world also has its own religion and its own mythology, but it's presented as science.
Exactly.
But isn't there also a kind of a dark side of religion that people can get kind of lost in religious beliefs as part of their madness, or they can use religious beliefs in an oppressive and harmful way? And then they can also point to, I know this is really certainly true of Christianity, and it's true of the Old Testament. There are all kinds of very oppressive practices done in the name of Christianity that are claimed to be grounded in Scripture, like slavery, for example, is endorsed in the Old Testament. You have all kinds of militarism and evangelical colonialism that's done to convert the heathens and convert the indigenous people. And so what is it that's in the tradition itself that you think still survives all of that misuse and appropriation for harmful things?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is appropriation. And I think there's a problem that happens too when we stop the dialogue, right? So certainly the God of the Old Testament gets a really bad rap sometimes. But if you look in there, like it doesn't say anywhere that like this God is like a white guy with a beard in the sky. And God, you know, in the Old Testament is definitely not down with slavery. Like there's this whole part where like slaves are liberated. But certainly, you know, some of the, you know, when looking at texts that are like 2,000 years old, we need to also be a part of the conversation and say, hey, you know, women weren't really involved in life back then in the way they are now. How do we bring a feminist lens to some of these traditions? How do we bring a queer lens? You know, it means making sure that we're having these conversations. And certainly like when it comes to sacred text, always in Judaism, it's about asking questions, kind of like we do in like a Hearing Voices group, right? Like I think a lot of people in our movement talk eloquently about like open dialogue. I feel like in Judaism, it's kind of like being an open dialogue with your ancestors. Like you're a part of this conversation. And so looking for metaphors, asking questions, you know, being curious, like what does that mean to you? If Moses like came to an HBN meeting, like what does fire represent to you, Moses? Is it heat? Does it represent like passion? Does it represent fear? Like what does it mean to you? And making sure we're having a dialogue that honors like all perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that is something that's very distinctive to Judaism, the kind of intellectual engagement with the scripture and the discussion and the exploring different points of views. There's an incredible curiosity and conversation that happens that really is emphasized in how you worship. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's very important. I remember once I was like studying like a page of Talmud with this guy, Arthur Kurzweil, an amazing rabbi. And he was talking and he was like, he said something interesting. He said, comfort is not a Jewish value, but meaning is. Looking for meaning, exploring, going deeper, looking beyond what's called the pashat, like the literal meaning of things. And I never forgot that. And it's helped me through like my own madness experiences, knowing like, hey, this might not be comfortable. I still struggle sometimes. I struggle honestly every day. I still have voices that can challenge me. But remembering like, it's less about being comfortable and it's about finding a space to look for meaning and also, of course, be supported by community as I grapple with that meaning instead of just having the conversation shut down.
If you're just tuning in, this is Madness Radio. Our guest today is Caroline Mazel-Carlton. She's a survivor of psychiatric crisis diagnosed with psychosis, and today she's the training director of the Wildflower Alliance. Caroline is part of the Jewish Renewal Movement and studying to be a rabbi. There are also a number of practices within Judaism that might, from the outside, look very crazy in a sense. Like there's a whole practice of talking with God, and people might have these kind of wild conversations with something that nobody else is hearing and express their conversation and be seen quite odd from the outside, but it's accepted as part of the cleaving practice. Is that what that is?
Totally. So there is one of the most profound prayers in all of Judaism is the Amidah. And there's this story that you read on Rosh Hashanah about this woman named Hannah who's like going through a horrible time in her life. She's dealt with like all these losses, and she goes to the temple to pray, and she's just like pouring her heart out to God. And this priest sees her, and he thinks that she's drunk, and he starts like being like, what are you doing, Hannah? Like, what are you doing? You're making a fool of yourself. But Hannah's like, no, like I'm praying. And later she's praying for a child, and she's given that child. And what people have interpreted that to mean is that Hannah, who's speaking her own words, like in a moment of pain, is actually teaching us how we should pray, that using our own words, like the words of our heart, even if we look a little strange to other people, that this opens these incredible gates. So certainly. And yeah, I know you had mentioned studying like some of the Hasidic masters like Rabbi Nachman certainly spoke about that too. And I think this is a really, we talk about sort of reclaiming practices, and there's a lot out there to be reclaimed. Like the Jewish renewal movement that I'm a part of was founded by a rabbi, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who saw a lot of people leaving Judaism in the 60s because they wanted to be able to do things like chanting and meditation. And what he said was like, wait a minute, this is in Judaism too. We just forgot about it because we came to the United States and we wanted to assimilate and have everyone think we're super normal. But we have all these practices, and it's about bringing some of them back.
Yeah, that was something I discovered when I was reading Carl Jung, that he really recommended that if you are interested in spiritual practice and that you are curious about different kinds of religious ways of seeing and being in the world, to really look at your ancestors, to look at your own roots, and to not sort of think that there's not anything there, and that instead you have to go outside of your own history. Because what happens is, sometimes Jung would say, when we look at, say, Eastern religion, if we look at Buddhism, or we look at Sufism, or we look at Hinduism, that we can romanticize and kind of turn it into this exotic way of achieving kind of the same things that we could if we really explored deeply enough in our own traditions. But sometimes we're sort of alienated from our own religious roots. We can't find a meditation practice. We can't find the same teachings. And so we sort of have to just jump out of our culture, but it's maybe not necessary. And in fact, it may even just kind of be confusing on some level. And if we can actually rediscover, and then also maybe not be running away from the pain or the abuse or the misinterpretation or the misuse of our religious traditions, then that can kind of revitalize it in a really deeply meaningful way for us. So I've always thought that that was a very interesting guidepost.
Yeah. And I think what happens is, you were talking earlier about how religion has been used to oppress. I think people have done that a lot. And when they do that, usually what goes out the window first are mystical practices.
So what do you mean when you say mystical practices? Help us understand what you mean by that.
So, for example, historically, like one of the first institutions to pathologize voice hearers, like to say that voice hearing was a result of a disease, was people in power in the Catholic Church, like in the Middle Ages. And the reason that they did that was they didn't want people going around and saying, oh, I heard this voice and it was the divine feminine, and she spoke to me and said, we need to honor her more in our ritual. Like the church didn't want that.
They want people turning to the priests for making their decisions about what to do, because it's a hierarchy, and it's an institution that has wealth and privilege and access and a whole authority structure.
Exactly. So another good way to like hold on to that control is to bury some of these practices that encourage like a direct connection.
Yeah, that was something that Jung said, that religion is about the mediation by an institution, whereas maybe spirituality or mysticism is more about actually directly experiencing God, having a direct personal relationship with the divine, or discovering that you are God. It's a very different thing. And one is much more maybe susceptible to being manipulated, or being told that someone is a representative of the divine, therefore you have to follow their authority, even if it means going off to war. In Judaism, is there more of a sympathetic understanding of something like voice hearing or seeing mystical visions? Like how does Judaism view voice hearing?
I think it's diverse, like in communities. A lot depends, on how much power medical model understandings have. So I will say, one of the reasons why I, want to become more involved and want to study to become a rabbi is I think our community could do better around not pathologizing and medicating these experiences.
Because it seems that there's lots of voice hearers in the Old Testament, and I imagine also in the Torah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're totally right. And, part of what I'm excited about in learning Hebrew and improving my Hebrew is to be able to translate prophetic texts. So like a lot of prophets, like one of my favorite, Jeremiah, he's kind of like a miserable dude. Like he's miserable. Like he hated being a prophet. It sucked because he was like a prophet during one of the hardest times in Jewish history. And like being a prophet meant that he had to hear and then like relay to people some really hard stuff. And I think that there's such a powerful example in there for those of us that, also have voices and visions, or those of us that just deal with like very deep states of despair. I've been really inspired by visiting Australia a couple of times and meeting a lot of people from the Aboriginal community that are also very active in reclaiming some of their traditions and language, and there's also folks that are doing that in this country and in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
people that are like, hey, like we lost a lot of our culture, we're suffering, and then the medical model has come in and is colonizing us all over again. We don't want that. And so it's an exciting conversation.
What are some other examples of stories from the Torah or practices in Judaism that maybe have some lessons for us around madness and mental health?
Yeah, I mean, a great one that's coming up is for Purim is Esther. So Esther is a story about someone who uses like revealing some of her story to liberate people. So with Esther, she was not out about being Jewish, and she marries a king. And then this king has an advisor that's like encouraging him to kill all the Jews. And so what Esther does is essentially she's like, wait a minute, I am Jewish. And it's this really terrifying moment for her. There's this powerful phrase where she's like trying to figure out, do I do this? Do I do this? Do I come out? Where, Mordecai says to her, perhaps this is the moment for which you were created.
Mm.
And it like brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. But I think there's a lesson in there about what's really going to create, I think, more dignity for people is if we're more open and honest about these experiences in general. I don't have to tell you how incredibly common non-consensus reality states are. Like research shows that they're very common, but no one's talking about them. And I think if we can't get past that problem if we can't start having the conversation and being open that we're really not going to create the world that we want.
That's a great example from the Esther story. Are there other stories or other examples that might be useful to hear about?
I guess one of the things that I'll just mention is there's a lot. So in terms of like the way I look at madness, there's a lot about it that I think can be cyclical or seasonal in a way, that we have these times of intense joy, or we might have these in times of deep sort of like grappling with difficulties. One of the things about Judaism that I think has been gotten lost, but there's people who are reclaiming it, is how earth-based it can be, how connected to the seasons and the moon. And so what I like is in Jewish practice, if you practice Jewishly, you become more attuned to cycles of the moon, like the new moon, the months. You have periods of deep introspection, like there's the month of Elul. And, there's times to grieve and for joy. And I think normalizing that life has these sort of like ups and downs, that's natural, that it can be connected to nature, and letting our practice do that can help us move through some of these times of like darkness. So it's not just, there's many, many ancestral stories, but it's also just the story of creation too.
One of the things that we hear in the mental health system a lot is, if you're sitting with someone, if you're supporting someone, or if you're a peer support worker, don't talk about spirituality, don't talk about religion, because you're just going to feed the person's psychosis or their madness. You're just going to kind of ignite passions, or you're going to create conflict, or you're just going to kind of trigger the person. What do you think about that? Isn't there some validity to the idea that maybe there's also some dangers of getting too religious or getting lost in religious symbolism? Sometimes people's madness seems that they're lost in these religious spiritual worlds, and everything kind of becomes about spirit, and they have a hard time kind of letting go of that. What would you say to that?
I think there's a lot of great examples of like after the ecstasy, the laundry. So I think it's totally important to have conversations about spirituality, but like, to bring it back to Judaism, after, the revelation at Sinai, like Moses still had to come down from the mountain and live amongst people. So a lot of the times, like it is like, how do I take this connection and then also bring it into my life and serve my community as well? I don't think we can get there if we aren't like really, open and honest.
So how does someone make that decision whether exploring spirituality or religion is going to be beneficial, or whether it might start to really lead them in the directions of being too ungrounded and disconnected?
I think it's a really personal decision, but it's always nice to have like a community and a teacher. Like so many folks like I've met like in hospitals, they're not given any type of guidance. Like I remember this one kid, he was having this vision of an eagle flying around, and of course they wanted to medicate him. But for him, it was like, it wasn't the eagle that was like freaky. It was just that the eagle wanted to eat him, and he didn't understand that. But, we did a little bit, we talked about it and explored it, and, found in a lot of world traditions, like being consumed by like a powerful animal, having those visions. Like sometimes anthropologists, they call it shamanic dismemberment, just as a general term. And what it means is like you're being initiated. Realizing these things have a context, but there's also a map. Like I remember my friend was supporting someone at the hospital, and he's like, this is really tough to deal with. He keeps telling me that like he's God and I'm the angel Gabriel. And I'm like, well, if you think about it, like Gabriel, like in Islam and Judaism and all these traditions, is a messenger. So, if he's saying that you are Gabriel, then like God often needs like Gabriel's support to like communicate with others. So it's like, maybe like he can allow you to help advocate for him because that's what Gabriel does. And sometimes like having these maps and talking them through can be really helpful, because I think we are spiritual beings. Like we have a human right to express our spirituality that should be acknowledged in these types of settings.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned shamanic dismemberment, and this is one of the reasons that people are drawn to shamanic traditions and shamanic practices, is this image of trauma and violence or tragedy or illness or psychosis or madness being part of the process of finding your calling. That you are, you're presented with this overwhelming difficulty that kind of tears you to pieces, but it's actually serving your ultimate purpose and your discovery of your gifts, really. Is there something parallel in Judaism that would maybe say similar things?
Yeah. I mean, I think all of Jewish history, like almost every Jewish holiday, for example, is one about survival. It's one about, facing annihilation, whether that's communal or personal, and finding a way to move through it. And so there's different ways that we acknowledge that. Like, Hanukkah is just a really beautiful one, certainly, where, being reminded of a dark time, but also, in Hanukkah, like we have this helper candle that lights all the other lights. It's called a shamash. So like going through these times of challenge and difficulty might bring us closer to who we actually are. And so we remember them constantly and then see those in our own life. Like, in Passover, when you are at a Passover Seder, you are expected, it's not like remember those slaves. Think about how you are enslaved. Be as if you yourself are a slave, and then remember like that process of liberation.
We've been talking about Judaism, but really there's a deeper common tradition that is at the roots of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, which is the whole children of Abraham, the same scriptures, the same books, the same stories. Moses appears in all three religions. Jesus appears in all three religions. Do you think that there's something really inspiring about the fact that these three world religions that are so much in conflict and war and political division today, that actually they have this common root as the children of Abraham?
I think there's something profoundly important about that. And there's this spiritual teacher that I really like. He's Indian, he's not Jewish, but his name is Meher Baba. And like one of the things he talks about is how the goal being to unite the world's religions like beads on one string. And what's cool about that, I think, is it's not about like mashing everybody into the same ball and like be like one mass, but acknowledge that we're these unique, special beads, each with its own beauty, but that we have this like common thread that runs through us and that holds us together and unites us. And those are the principles of love and justice and holiness, the holiness of life and of nature and creation that definitely unite many of these traditions.
I keep running into just the simple teaching that if the mental health system would just follow the golden rule of just treat the other as you yourself would want to be treated, that would kind of solve it. That so many of the world religions are just about mutuality and love, and that's essentially what's missing from the mental health system and from so many of our institutions that are oppressing us and causing violence in the world.
Absolutely. Welcome the stranger.
Caroline, are there other stories that you'd like to share from the Jewish tradition?
Yes. There's one last story that I'd like to share. I'd like to talk a little bit about death because I think a lot of times fear of death can lead to practices and protocols that really backfire in the mental health system. I think just discomfort around the topic of death. I remember being trained by the amazing Rabbi Kaya Stern Kaufman to be a member of a Chevra Kadisha. So a Chevra Kadisha is essentially a Jewish burial society. And so in Jewish practice around death, we don't view death as quite this like and or thing. Like it's more of a process. It's not like, oh, your heart stops beating, you're dead. There's kind of, in our tradition, like a person's soul kind of sticks around for a little while. And because of this, it's really critical that we treat a person with a great deal of respect and honor, even though their heart has stopped beating and they're not breathing. Like, we wouldn't, cut them up if we don't have to, or put chemicals on them. Like you would wash them really gently. There's like a process. So I was being trained in this process. And I remember someone asking Kaya, like, Rabbi, would we do this to a person if they'd committed suicide? And the rabbi was like shocked. She was like, of course. Like, and if you've heard anyone teaching otherwise, like, I would like to have their name. I want, that's, of course we would do this. And I remembered that deeply, of course, as someone who has tried to kill myself before. But I also, what I've learned from this process of like sitting with people who want to die and also sitting with people, because in our tradition, we don't leave people alone until after they're buried. Like you stay with someone. So that has meant like me kind of sitting with someone who's died, for a couple hours, like through the night or whatever. Like we take shifts, and it's always this really profound experience. Sometimes I hear voices, so sometimes I hear them, or I hear God, or I hear our ancestors. And there's something that I've learned a lot from that, just about the power and the dignity of being there, not trying to fix anything, because I can't fix anything, but like honoring like the holy transition time that I really have come to apply to sitting with people who want to die. Sometimes we treat people who want to die, especially in the system, like what happened to me, like they take your belt, they take your shoes. You're not treated with dignity. And I guess what I would like to see is more, I think a person who wants to die is also in this sort of sacred transitional time. Like they're a person that they know the life that they have isn't working, but they haven't quite moved on to the next thing. So there's something really important about that state. And it's not about like fixing it, but it's about witnessing it and being there and honoring the dignity and the sacredness of that moment that I think is really important. So that's one of the things that I've learned, and what I would just like to see, and I think spirituality can help us here, is to honor that state more and honor the fact that death will happen to us all. We can't always control it, but that we should be there present and, in a state of openness, awareness, and compassion.
Beautiful. Caroline, we don't have much time left in the interview. Give us contact information, how people can get in touch with you and find out more about your work, and also maybe a few books or resources that you would want to recommend for people who are interested in Judaism, especially the maybe mystical aspect of Judaism and how it may relate to mental health issues or people who are struggling with crisis, or interested in madness or learning from madness?
Yeah. So to get in touch with me, the website for my organization is www.westernmassrlc.org. That's the letter RLC.org. And you can send an email to me there and it'll get forwarded to me. If you're excited to learn more about Jewish renewal, there's an organization called Aleph that has a website where you can begin to explore, maybe find a Jewish renewal community near you or explore online classes. I also really love the site ritualwell.com for really innovative and powerful Jewish ritual and intention.
Caroline Mazel-Carlton, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Thanks for having me, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with Caroline Mazel-Carlton. She is a survivor of psychiatric crisis and being diagnosed with psychosis. She's the director of training of the Wildflower Alliance, formerly known as the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. She's part of the Jewish renewal movement and studying to be a rabbi. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio host is Will Hall, producer is Nina Packabush. Madness Radio is an affiliate of Madden America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at maddenamerica.com.